Tonight's program, The Recovering Body, will be presented by Jennifer Matesa. Jennifer is an award-winning and popular author, speaker, blogger, and educator who has written about health and life transformation for more than 20 years and has been writing and speaking about addiction and recovery since 2010. Her book, The Recovering Body, Physical and Spiritual Fitness for Living Clean and Sober, was published in 2014, and her forthcoming book about sexuality and recovery is due to be published this year. Please help me in welcoming Jennifer Matesa.
So what I'm going to be talking to you tonight about is about how the body recovers. I wrote this book that you see up here, and it was published in 2014. And I wrote it in response to an inquiry from Hazelden Publishing. They had read a piece of mine, a journalistic piece that I had written about 3 triathletes who had used exercise to recover. And they said, write us a book about exercise. And I said, well, if you want a book about physical recovery, it has to be about a lot more than just exercise. So what I wrote became The Recovering Body. Great. Yes, so why the recovering body? And why me? Why me was because I was addicted to prescription painkillers for 6.5 years. I went and sought treatment for 2 neurological conditions, migraine, which I'd had since I was 14, and fibromyalgia, which I'd had since probably around the time I gave birth to my son in 1997. And this was 2002, and what happened in 2002, they introduced the new Joint Commission guidelines that made pain the 5th vital sign. So, and OxyContin came onto the market. So the specialists that I was interviewing for as a writer for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, high-level people who were rewriting policy, pain policy and pain treatment guidelines across the country, including the Joint Commission guidelines, said, you need to go to a pain clinic. And they didn't mean a Florida pill mill, they meant the University of Pittsburgh Pain Clinic, which fortunately was, 5 blocks from my house, and I went there, and they gave me compounded hydrocodone, first off, without the Tylenol. Then they added morphine to that. So certainly within a year, I was on 150 milligrams of Vicodin Zero without the Tylenol, and 120 milligrams of morphine, so 270 milligrams of opioids for migraine and fibromyalgia, okay? And then it only went up from there because pretty soon my doctor said, oh, here's some handy-dandy coupons for some Actic lollipops. You can go get them for free. You know what Actic is? It's fentanyl. So I was given free fentanyl, which was awesome for someone who was an addict. But I was one of hundreds of thousands of people who are at risk of fatal overdose. So I began to get scared because sometimes when I started abusing my medicines, which was almost right away, and nobody ever screened me for familial history of addiction or anything, and I come from a whole rat warren of addicts in my family. As soon as I started abusing it, I could feel my respiration depressing, like a pallet of bricks on my chest. And I used to wonder sort of dimly, am I going to be awake in the morning? So some statistics about this problem that I had. The National Institute on Drug Abuse says 2.4 million Americans used prescription drugs non-medically within the last year, and more than half were female. And you can see that the growth among women especially has really exceeded that among men. So more women are using prescription drugs to deal with life. And they're becoming addicted. And the fatal overdoses are what scare people. That's what drives a lot of policy, treatment policy. We were talking about that today. $1.1 billion is being funneled toward the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, and a lot of that is going to go toward medication maintenance. And anybody who's been through Dawn Farm knows that you can live life without that stuff. So anyway, but I was one of the women who was at risk. And I just need to put a plug in here for other addictions, including smoking, because smoking is huge in treatment centers, I learned when I did this book, and because it kills 500,000 people in our country alone per year. And my mother died of, I put this on the slide partly because my mother died in 1999 at age 58 of lung cancer. And I'm 51, so she was like 7 years older than I am right now. She was a lot sicker and a lot heavier, and she could never quit smoking. So, you know, we have all kinds of addiction in this country, not just prescription drug addiction. So the story is going to start with Jen at 7 years old on her bike in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. I wasn't riding on the road. There was nowhere to ride, so I was riding in the grass. So how are you going to ride in the grass? You can't really ride in the grass. And I wasn't getting much exercise, and I was raised on the long shelf life diet. And look at the prices on those, man. 10 for 65 cents, right? So if you go to the inflation calculator at westegg.com, you find out that that's about $2.50 for food that would last forever in my mom's cabinet, right? Food that lasts forever is dead, okay? It doesn't have nutritional value. But I took those apple pies with Linus in my lunchbox and Ho-Hos, and I ate those horrible cardboard Pop-Tarts. That's what I was fed on when I was a kid. And I wound up overweight until I hit puberty, and then I slimmed down a little bit, mostly because I joined the marching band and we had to march. Duh. So I began to be very, very concerned about my weight, and I never had a very good handle on my feelings. It was very hard for me to deal with my feelings. This is me 2 weeks before I detoxed in 2008. I did not detox at a treatment facility. I wanted to go in, and I called a treatment facility, Gateway Rehab, which is a pretty well-known rehab, and I basically asked them if they would please detox me over the phone, and they were like, no, we can't do that. You have to actually come in for detox. I said, well, do you know anybody who could like detox me without my having to live somewhere other than my house? I didn't know that was called outpatient then. They referred me to one guy, and then my primary care physician, who knew I was on these drugs, referred me to the same guy, so I went to him. And he used Suboxone. And I don't know what possessed me to take these pictures. I took a series of pictures of myself right before I detoxed, and look at how skinny I am. I just can't believe it. And these are my eyes. Sometimes people ask me, how can you tell if people are on drugs? That's how you can tell if people are on drugs. You can hide a lot, but you can't make your pupils dilate when you have, heroin or fentanyl inside you. And look at the lost expression on my face. This is me 2 years after I ended my detox. First year was damn hard, but the second year got very much better. Like my skin is clearer, my eyes are brighter, I just look like I know what I'm doing. And the pupils are really big. And sometimes even now, I look at myself in the mirror and look at those big pupils, and I think that's what I've achieved, I can look like a sane person. So this book talks about, first, how addiction trashes the body. A lot of times when we do recovery, 12-step abstinence-based recovery, we hear that it's a spiritual malady, so the solution is spiritual. And I believe that. I think that the solution is spiritual, but part of what my spiritual solution is bringing mindfulness to all parts of my life, and I just did not remember my body for the first year that I was sober. I kicked off of Suboxone. I was on it for 2 months, and I kicked the 1st of November 2008, and I spent those first 14 months just in hell. It was so hard for me because of what addiction had done to my body. These are some of the symptoms that people experience when they're addicted. They get GI dysfunction. My dad was an alcoholic. He died of cancer and cirrhosis, and his belly blew up like a balloon at the end. It was horrible. It was excruciating for him, and very painful for everyone else to watch. People don't sleep in addiction. You think you don't sleep in withdrawal or detox. You actually don't really sleep very well in addiction either. That's why we have those dark circles under our eyes. We experience sexual dysfunction, a lot of us, especially people who use sedatives like benzodiazepines or alcohol. Alcohol definitely changes the sex hormones, and opioids threw me into menopause. As soon as I started taking Cadian, which was morphine, about 6 months in, I noticed, oh my gosh, I don't have a period anymore. Like, it took me so long to realize. And then it took me 6 more months to actually tell my doctor, because basically I didn't give a shit about anything anymore. And when I told her, she said, you have to go for a bone density test immediately, scheduled me, and I had actually lost bone density. Because when you're a woman of 37, you need estrogen to build your bones. So, so these problems can cause long-running problems. Emotional dysfunction can cause panic disorder, which is a physical symptom, emotional numbing and inability to connect. So your partner can put his arms around you and you might not actually feel them because you're wasted. And dysfunction in pain regulation. So there's this thing called hyperalgesia, which actually, when you take loads of painkillers, it makes your pain worse. So when you go to the doctor, sometimes they'll notice some of these symptoms, if you're lucky, and they'll treat the symptoms, but they won't ask you. I watched this with my dad. You know, he had the red spots that you get when your liver starts breaking down, and the doctor said, oh, well, you might need to cut down on your beer. You can't do that. She never said, sir, you have addiction, you're addicted, and we need to treat that. So they'll treat the symptoms, or if they can, they might not be able to, but the underlying disease remains untreated. So the first modality I cover in this book is exercise. And what I did after I relapsed at the beginning of 2010, I relapsed one day, and I decided I had to do something different because that's what we do. I undertook P90X. Well, I spent the first year sort of walking and playing tennis, and then I decided I would go whole hog and do P90X. And P90X is a serious, intense, like boot camp style, you know, back and shoulders one day, legs and legs another day, and like yoga another day, and cardio another day, kickboxing and stuff like that. So I did two 90-day rounds of that, and at the end, that's what I looked like. I had actual definition in my body for the first time. Like, this is a girl who, when she was in 6th grade and had to do the presidential fitness test and had to do the flexed arm hang, she was like not doing the flexed arm hang. But I actually was able to do 5 pull-ups. And there was something about achieving that changed me, that made me understand I could do more in my life than I thought I could. Just as a reminder, that's what I looked like right before I detoxed. So no tone in my body at all, and very, very skinny. I thought if I was skinny, I was okay because I was skinny, and that's what you need to be in this culture, is skinny. But I learned in exercise what I wanted to be was healthy and strong. Whoops. Yes. So I read a lot of books while I was researching this, The Recovering Body, and one was Daniel Lieberman's The Story of the Human Body. And in it, he talks about how we often say that movement is medicine, but we don't often think about how a sedentary lifestyle is actually illness. So that's kind of my touchstone these days. I try to keep myself relatively active. And some research that shows that exercise actually is good for emotional problems. So there was a Duke University study that found that after a year, the people who were running, the depressed people who were running, 90% of those people were still in remission from clinical depression, while 1/3 of the people who were taking an SSRI had actually relapsed. So depression, and that's just one study, there are other studies that show that exercise it way surpasses, it's not just as good as, in many cases it way surpasses medication for clinical depression. And these people at the bottom are some of the people that I talked to for my book who use exercise disciplines, various modalities, to help people with addiction heal from their addiction. And this is a picture of Phoenix Multisport. They're located this is the Denver site. They're located in Boulder. They're located in Orange County, and I think they have another facility. And this guy is Scott Strode. He's the one who founded it. And he is really out there bringing fitness and exercise and physical movement to people who have addiction. And it's not just the movement. They don't do it by themselves. They get together in community, like you guys do at your farm, right? They get together in community and hike the mountains, hike the Flatirons outside of Boulder. He says, later on in this talk, he says that you can build community just as well around a CrossFit board in a gym as you can climbing up a hill. So it's really about community. And so these are some of the benefits of exercise for folks in recovery. A couple of my favorites are increasing self-confidence, because I never thought I could do the things that I was doing when I was doing P90X. I mean, it's just about practice, right? We learn in recovery to practice these principles in all our affairs. It's just practice. And also the establishing community. That's the quotation from Scott Strode about CrossFit. And mentoring and giving it away can also be super helpful. So lots of people go on group cycles and form communities where they exercise together. But it also does raise levels of dopamine and endorphins, which are the chemicals that are involved in addiction. So the second modality, that brings us to the second modality, which is nutrition. So this is a picture of me and my little sister on my 8th birthday. And I put this here not only because I want you to see my sweet little sister's face, but also because look at that, and also the 70s wallpaper, right? But like the cake, like my treats were sugar. Like when I celebrated anything, I celebrated with a lot of sugar. So I had a big cake, and it was sure chocolate underneath the icing, and a glass of Coke in front of me, and it wasn't Diet Coke because they didn't have Diet Coke back then. And my dad has his Zippo in the corner, which is a sure sign that he was smoking. So there was like substance use going on all around me. So yeah, some people have said, yeah, you got to take this slide out of here because I can quit sugar anytime. But this sugar is probably my first drug. You know, I realized while I was writing this book that I used sugar to deal with my emotions. Sugar changes the brain, it increases dopamine, and boosts endorphins in the same ways that cocaine and opioids do. And also, I talked to experts, including Kathy Ketchum, who wrote a really wonderful book about alcoholism and hypoglycemia and, you know, pseudo pre-diabetes syndrome. It seems that erratic processing of blood sugar is thought to underlie alcoholism. And this is fabulous. Scientists told me that, you know how you have 4 tastes in your tongue? Well, after you eat enough bitter or salty or sour, you don't taste those anymore, but you can keep eating sweet forever, and you'll keep tasting sweet forever. And that's part of evolution, because your caveman body wants you to go out and get that nutrition. So, but the bitter stuff is the poison stuff. So it doesn't want you, it's cautioning you against that bitter stuff. But so that's what makes it so much harder. Our evolution is against us. These are just diagrams of like what happens when we eat sugar. This is a normal brain, and this is the cocaine brain, that's the obese brain. They're pretty much the same. This is with chronic sugar intake. Whoops. Uh-oh. How did I do that? I just gave away my joke. I said, do we really want to add sugar to all the other substances? Like, duh. Yes, we do, because we're addicts. But I wanted to show you the fatty liver. That's what happens. When we eat too much sugar, fatty liver syndrome is it's an increasingly common syndrome in our public health today. Your liver's located right here. In recovery, I've become very, very protective of my liver. I love my liver. I found out during writing this book that the liver is actually, you think of it as a filter, but it's actually more like a washing machine, because if you overload it, and we overload it with sugar or fats, those are the 2 things we overload it with, and alcohol is just sugar. What happens to a washing machine when you overload it? And by the way, if anybody has any questions, you can ask me. The washing machine overflows. So the toxins spill out. When we have fatty liver, our liver doesn't work anymore, or it doesn't work optimally. So we build up toxins in our bodies, and we start feeling like crap. That's why we feel like crap in post-acute withdrawal syndrome, because we have all those toxins in our bodies. So best practices for nutritional practices for recovery, there are a million. And one thing I try not to do in my books is present like this is what you have to do to have the perfect life, because I don't think there is one thing. Everybody's different, and I'm trying to help people find their own way. But it is true that when we get into recovery, a lot of us are nutritionally seriously deficient, if not malnourished. I mean, that skinny Jen up there was malnourished. I didn't have any stamina. And one of the critical nutrients that we need are the B vitamins, especially B12, to build healthy nerve tissue, so that we can begin to think better, because when we begin to think better, we make better decisions. Also, eating high-quality vegetables is super important. So this is my big sister in recovery, Lori, and I sneaked a picture of her sleeping on vacation last summer. I decided sleep had to be a big part of any book on physical recovery, because one of the biggest complaints that I hear through my blog, Guinevere Gets Sober, that's my blog, and it's been running for 6.5 years. People write into me, I just detoxed, when am I ever going to sleep again? I'll never sleep again. Tell me what I can take to sleep again. How long does the insomnia last? They'll ask me. And I remember how I felt, and I thought I was never going to survive it. And people would say, lack of sleep never killed anybody. So this is me and my son just before I detoxed. I have really dark circles under my eyes, not only because I have toxins in my body, but also because I basically was using, and it wrecked my sleep cycles. I would go to bed at like 2 in the morning, get up at 7, like fall asleep during the day at some time, get up, make dinner, and use and fall. I mean, it was just all over the place. And look how healthy he looks by contrast. And then this is the year that the book was published, a couple years ago. And we both look healthy. So this is like this picture touches me so much, not only because it was my 50th birthday, but because like people say we don't recover. Like people say people like me who were on fentanyl for a long time, or heroin, or whatever drug, can't stand in front of you without a drug inside them. And I don't have drugs inside me today, and I haven't needed drugs for 6.5 years. So like, there are many of you out in the audience who don't, so I'm not the only person. So I want to counter this notion that we have to be like this forever. Like that's not necessary. And by the way, my son is a huge supporter of my recovery. He's very, very proud of me. So here are 2 really interesting studies. I wanted to add some science to this book to show you that these modalities are really sound. The first is that people actually drink just to sleep. Like ordinary non-alcoholics drink just so they can sleep. So there's a lot of people are losing sleep in this country. It's not just people in recovery or people in addiction. But if you take people in treatment, the numbers double. They have twice as many in treatment have used alcohol to sleep. And also insomnia, we know, is a predictor of relapse. So if we can't get the sleeping thing under control, we're bound to fail in our recovery at some point, or just not protect it. And Michigan, right? This is a really awesome study. It's the only study that has looked at insomnia in young children, or sleep problems in kids who are really young, leading to later use, and not very much later, like by 12 or 11, use of cigarettes or alcohol or weed or whatever to control their sleeping. So it's really important that we teach our children. One way I think that we can prevent alcoholism and addiction in families is to teach our children how to treat their bodies well. Anyway, this was the first study to examine that relationship between early sleep problems and onset of addiction. And I hate this saying. I hate it. I hated it then and I hate it now. Please come on in. There are other options to treat insomnia, and Amnesty International says lack of sleep is insomnia is like a form of torture. That's what they do to torture people if they want to break you down. So a lot of the research I looked at said, well, we don't really know why we sleep, but this explains why we sleep. And you can access this, by the way. The handouts that you have will let you access this presentation later, so you can look at the research. But basically, they found that in animals, lost sleep kills brain cells. And they also found that this is a really cool thing, that sleep actually shrinks the tissue, the nerve tissue, and enlarges the spaces, the interstices between the neurons, so that the body's lymph fluid and other fluids can wash away the toxins. So I just thought this was perfect. I mean, sleep is detox, right? And that's why we need to sleep. That's why we need to protect our sleep and learn how to really sleep. But meanwhile, people are asking for sleep aids, like just give me Ambien, or just give me Sonata, or just give me, Xanax or whatever. And the scientists told me that those things only add like 30 minutes of sleep to your sleeping time. And they don't even really give you deep sleep. So Steve Scanlon, who runs Palm Beach Outpatient Detox, he detoxes people. He's one of the only doctors I've found who will reliably detox people from high levels of buprenorphine and Suboxone in this country. He says during that really rigorous detox, he uses the medicines that hit the receptors, the only receptors that we haven't wrecked so far in our recovery. And he says that if you want to sleep better in your detox or in your post-acute detox, you just need to start exercising. So all these modalities are synergistic. So if you want to sleep better, you need to exercise. If you want to exercise, you need to eat better. They're all intertwined. So I also decided that if we were going to talk about physical recovery, it couldn't just be exercise or sleep or nutrition. It had to be sexuality too. I love this quotation by Henry David Thoreau, because it's so hard for people to listen about sexuality or speak about sexuality. It's not hard for me to speak about it, but it's hard for a lot of people to listen to it. They're like, I can feel like the room is like, what's she going to tell us? The main thing I'm going to tell you is that people do not look at how much addiction and substances screw up our hormones. It's really serious. This study shows that it's one of the most underdiagnosed problems when you're treating anybody with addiction. Anybody who's coming in with an opioid addiction ought to have their sex hormone levels checked, I think. And I thought it was really interesting that they said people who were treated long-term with opioids had these problems, and by long-term they meant 1 month, which was nothing compared to the time that I took opioids. And also in recovery, we need to learn how to have sex again. Kevin McCauley, who I think you guys have seen in this series, I interviewed him for this book. He's in there. I said, when did you first have sex after you got sober? He said, in treatment. Duh. Like if you can't get laid in treatment, you can't get laid. That's what he said. I'm sorry, I'm being bad, but he said, Kevin's a real neurological genius, and he said addiction starts as a disorder of genetics and pleasure and ends as a disorder of choice. So he's the one who taught me about the prefrontal cortex up here being divorced from the limbic brain, which is right underneath the back of your head at the top of your spine. That controls sex, that part of your brain. But when you're addicted, drugs rise to the top of it. But when that's not the right slide. When I went into withdrawal, any amount of withdrawal, drugs would drop pretty quickly down that list, and sex would rise back up. So it was just like, if I went into withdrawal, I could feel that little lion in my belly saying, let's go get some, But when I was on my steady dose of painkillers, no way. I could not feel that. I felt it's important to point out that women are more vulnerable sexually than men during detox and early recovery, partly because of the prejudices against us by the criminal justice system, and we also experience more emotional mood disorders. And we end up looking towards sex to satisfy those. That's not to say that men never do that, right? But women can confuse, if we want to just get our rocks off, we don't just go get our rocks off. We think we have to be in love to do it, so we'll turn that situation into love. In my forthcoming book, I heard that time and time and time again. I heard it from people who are recovering from addiction, and I heard it from the sex educators that I interviewed, and I heard it from sober coaches and all kinds of people. Women fool themselves into thinking that they're in love just so that they can have sexual pleasure. So this is my way of talking about my sexual response. This is Magritte's famous painting of a pipe. It says in French, "This is not a pipe," because it's a picture of a pipe. Well, this is not a vibrator, because it's a picture of a vibrator. And it's my vibrator. It's an awesome little Japanese silicone vibrator. I recommend it highly. Because it's very small and it's quiet. So this is what my vibrator taught me. And the reason I bought this vibrator, I actually didn't buy this vibrator. This is one of my vibrators. I have another vibrator I have is Charlotte. Remember Charlotte in Sex and the City used a vibrator, and it was the rabbit vibe. And I thought, well, if I'm going to investigate this problem, because I knew I had a problem, I couldn't have an orgasm. And I couldn't feel my sexual response. So I thought, I'm going to go buy a machine. That's the cure, right? Like it's either a drug or a device. So I'll go buy the device, and I'll buy Charlotte's device, and it'll cure me. And I cranked that damn thing up and nothing, right? But when I went into withdrawal, which I never wanted to do, but if I thought it was about time that I ought to be having sex, or if I ran out of drugs, I went into withdrawal, and I could have multiple orgasms. And I had basically thought multiple orgasms were an urban myth, but they're not an urban myth. I interviewed for my book coming out this fall a neuroscientist who said, no, you don't really have multiple orgasms. And I was like, I do have multiple orgasms. He was like, no, you just have like one that goes on and on and on. And I was like, who cares what you call it, man? It's long and it lasts a long time and it feels great. So this is actually one reason why I wanted to detox eventually. Aside from the fact that I had begun to lie to everyone, I was stealing compulsively, I was super unhealthy, and I was paranoid all the time that I was going to get caught because I was changing dates on scripts. I wanted my life back, and one of the first things I wanted back was a normal sexual response, because I knew I had one. And one question I really think is interesting, especially for women, is that female biology allows us to have this fabulous response to sex, but psychology and society don't necessarily want us to have this. So I think that, I know for myself, I was married for a long time to somebody who was very jealous, and one really serious benefit of opioids in my body was that I just never looked at anybody else, and that made him happy. So this was a question that was asked me when I was talking about this book. I think it was in Chicago this day. A therapist came up to me afterwards and said, can I just ask you this question? I don't know what to do about it. We don't let our women have vibrators, and we don't let them have relationships for a year. So how do we help them explore their pleasure? And I was like, I don't know. I seriously don't know. And then in researching this question for the book that is coming out this fall, I began to think about how normal, healthy pleasure is a fearsome thing for some of us in recovery. I heard from people that I can't have pleasure because it might be addictive. I might get addicted to sex. I might get addicted to my vibe. I asked these questions. I asked Emily Nagoski, who wrote Come As You Are, a really popular book about sex, can you get addicted to vibrators? She said there's no evidence that you can, but we will come up with any reason to deny ourselves pleasure and create some kind of no-win situation in our minds so that we have to go out and use and like relieve the pressure. Anyway, I thought it was a super interesting question, and I talk a lot about these and other questions, basically questions of human touch. Like, this is not just a book about, not this book, but the book that's coming out in the fall. It's not just a book about how to date in sobriety, you know, because you can go on Cosmo and look at that. It's about how to bring more touch into everyone's lives, because touch is supremely healing. I've talked to scientists and just ordinary people. I mean, how comforting was it when your mother ran her fingers through your hair like that, or when a lover of yours does that to you? But do you ever ask for it? If you don't have a partner, who do you get that from? You know? So these, and it reduces cortisol. It helps us deal with stress. It has all kinds of benefits, but society doesn't want us to touch each other. You know? It's super fearsome. So I began to ask this question in lots of different ways, and the book this fall presents some answers and suggestions. So the last modality in the recovering body is meditation. And you might wonder why meditation, like a brainy act, is in a book about physical recovery. Well, because the brain is part of the body, and because the brain is not just in the head. There are many brains throughout the body. The GI tract is a huge brain. Excuse me, probably 2/3 of the human immune system is in the GI tract. The heart, the human heart, has its own electromagnetic field, so we have brains all over the place. And also because a lot of people have misconceptions about what meditation does for human beings. A lot of people think that it's just to fall asleep. And I talked to Willoughby Britton at Brown, and her mission in life is to let people know that meditation is not to put you to sleep. If it puts you to sleep, you're doing it wrong. Meditation is actually to wake you up. Meditation is push-ups for this part of the brain that gets shut down by that part of the brain back here. So if you have the limbic brain governs sex, sleep, self-defense, food, things like that. And drugs move to the top of the list in addiction. And you have a disconnect between your forebrain up here, which is a much newer part of your brain, which is the part of your brain that says, nah, you don't need that brownie. You just had one. In addiction, the connection, the dialogue between those two parts gets severed. That's what Kevin McCauley taught me. So the parents up here are no longer talking to the kids, and the kids are like running the house. So meditation puts the parents back in charge. They're literally like push-ups for your forebrain. And Willoughby Britton talks about, in my book, about how rehabilitation of this part of the brain is the name of the game in recovery. These are ways that meditation can benefit you if you're in recovery, especially the last one. How many of us have done something either stupid or not so stupid, or gone through an accident or something and blamed ourselves and talked self-critically to ourselves? What an idiot, why did I do that? I can't believe it, and now I have to deal with the consequences. Meditation, bringing the attention back to the breath, and back to the breath, then back to the breath, over and over again, for 5 minutes a day, puts a kind of Teflon coating down in the mind, and those self-criticisms kind of skitter off. They don't stick as well. So that's why meditation is so much more important. So we're getting close to the end. For decades, I've been hearing about your brain on drugs, right? The frying pan with the eggs in it, frying away. And I started wondering a long time ago, and I actually have posted stuff on my blog asking Nora Volkoff to stick me in the scanner and scan my brain on recovery. Because why don't they scan us if we're healthy? You know, they're always looking at the disease. Why not look at the cure or the solution? So I found one guy who is. He's at NYU, and he is sticking people with long-term recovery in magnetic resonance imaging machines. And he's asking them to say neutral, or read neutral stuff, like read the New York Times or something neutral that has no emotional import. And then, and he scans their brains, shoots live action video, and then he asks them to say recovery prayers. the serenity prayer, the first step prayer, the third step prayer, the seventh step prayer, anything about surrender. And he says there's some transformation people undergo when they have a spiritual awakening that changes the process of addiction inside the brain. So he has pictures of this. And somebody asked me today, well, what's the results of the study? He can't get enough people. Like if you're in New York, he wants to hear from you, okay? So call him up. He'll stick you in the scanner. You'll help foster, research about recovery. And it's not, lest there be folks out there who are afraid of the God thing. I mean, I'm an atheist. I think of myself as not believing in God. But AA works fine for me. It's not about God or religion or creed or anything. It's about surrendering control of life's uncontrollableness to something outside, something not us. And that's what he's measuring. And that's what constitutes the spiritual awakening that he's referring to. So if you're afraid of meditation, you're afraid you're going to do it wrong, you don't want to do it, blah, 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 you can do a lot of other things. You can walk the dog, you can do yoga, you can knit. One of the first posts I ever put on my blog was about how helpful knitting is for people in addiction. All kinds of stuff will help bring you back to yourself, but the most important thing is that you calm your body and that you feel your breath, because that's the thing that continues, isn't it a miracle? Continues to keep you alive. You've been sitting here listening to me, and you haven't been thinking every half second, breathe, breathe, breathe. It's breathing for you. It's keeping you alive. So to pay a little bit of attention in gratitude is a really healthy thing. So I put this here because I had this synergistic, wonderful little moment with Dawn Farm. I posted this. This link will lead you to a blog post that I posted that says, I'm not a unicorn. I was in the New York Post in December, and they put a lot of stuff in about me. They wanted to talk to me because I met all their demographics, like middle-aged, white mom, living in like not a big city or whatever. And who, by the way, had recovered from addiction. And and one of the things that didn't get in was, like, I don't have to take anything to recover, like I'm abstinent in my recovery. So I wrote a blog that said, she forgot to say this, so lest you read the story and not read this, I want to tell you I'm not a unicorn. There are a lot of us out there. And Jason emailed me with 1 million exclamation points. We have this project called I'm Not a Unicorn. So I just want to pitch this project because it's a wonderful project. It's somewhere on Dawn Farm's website, right? I'm sure you'll find it on Dawn Farm's website. It's a collection of people who have long-term, that is to say, over 5 years of recovery from substances. I think from opioids, but I'm not sure. Opioids, right. So none of us are unicorns. Many of us in here have achieved long-term abstinent recovery. And this is the next book that's coming out. It's hard to see. Oh, I guess you can see it up there better. But I did 36 interviews with ordinary folks, and it's organized like a virtual meeting. Its subtitle is A Meeting Between the Covers. So I have speakers and I have topics that will help start the dialogue about how to bring more touch into our lives in recovery, because it's so healing and so important, and it fosters community. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I would be delighted to have any questions that you have. That I had said that we live in a society that's fearful of touch, and why? And have I come to any conclusions about why the society is that? What's causing that fearfulness? Well, I mean, so I talked to I have my own opinions, but I want to tell you what the scientists say first. I talked to a woman who runs the Touch Research Institutes in Florida, which is the country's preeminent research base for human touch. And she has research that shows that in other cultures such as Italy, such as France, such as Latin America, cultures that are sort of more Southern European and South American, there is much more touch and more physical engagement between people who are, not necessarily lovers, but just people who are friends. Men are more likely to give each other prolonged hugs or even hold hands, okay? And in this country, which was populated by Anglo-Saxons and the Dutch at the beginning, I mean, it's no longer that way, but that's its origins. That's the origins of its ethics. And also the British society, Scandinavian societies, Germanic societies, those societies are much more touch averse. So I think, people are bound to say it's American Puritanism, right? But it's cultural. I'm sure that there are, I think they did research in, for example, Miami, and people in Miami touch each other much more than people do in other cities where those cultures have not made such headway into the life of those cities. But I think that we simply, one thing I notice is that people simply don't have language for it. It's hard to say, we can sometimes say I'm lonely, but it's hard for people. How many times have you been sitting in a meeting, a 12-step meeting or any other meeting, and noticed a look on somebody's face that just shows that they have not been touched in years? And that is called touch hunger, It's starvation. It doesn't just happen with babies. I was clear with the scientists about this. I said we know that babies actually fail to thrive if they're not touched, but we also suffer from that. So, but babies cry. What do? We pick them up. But we don't want to cry. We don't want to betray our weakness. We don't have time. There's all sorts of things in this culture that might suggest. These are all guesses because I'm not a scientist, but that's what I think. And one thing that this book, I hope, does is bring some language. I tried to pay attention to language and also bring a motivation to start a discussion. I was talking with people about this today, and someone was saying, well, what can we do about this? Bring more touch. And someone said, well, the first thing we can do is just talk about it. Well, that's the first thing to do, is talk about it. We need to talk about how we need to touch each other more. It's super important. We're evolved for it. There are medications that work against migraine. First, you ought to get a really clear diagnosis, I think, from a neurologist. And I'm not a doctor, so I can't give you medical advice. And also, migraine is a lot more common among women. I think it's to the degree that 85% of all migraines occur with women and only 15% with men. And mine were largely hormonal, so now that I'm in menopause, it's much easier for me. But before I went into menopause, it was hard, and I took Imitrex and other triptan medications that would squeeze the blood vessels in my head. And those are not opioid medications. So I think that you should work with, I would recommend that you work with a really reputable neurologist. And let the neurologist know that you don't want to take opioids, that you want to try other things. Also, staying away from caffeine. I don't know how much caffeine you drink. So the question was, what am I doing to take care of my fibromyalgia? I still get migraine, not as often, though. Fibromyalgia is a different story, and I think I probably will always have chronic pain of a fibromyalgia kind. I've started getting Rolfing. I was reading Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, in which he talks about, a lot of women, another thing this book in the fall talks about is how many women come to recovery with trauma, sexual or physical trauma or emotional trauma, and I have trauma, and so one of the best things he says you can do is to get body work because the traumatic memories, he says, are held in the body. So I take a moderate dose of Neurontin, and that's the only medication I take on a regular basis. And I exercise moderately. Another reason I don't do P90X anymore is because it's just too extreme. And I have a habit of beating the shit out of myself for anything. And if I didn't do my 160, if I did 150 push-ups that day, I'd be like, I have to do 10 more, and I would crank them out and I'd overshoot it. So I try to practice moderation in my physical exercise and understand that if I walk the dog for 45 minutes or an hour a day, that's sufficient exercise for me that day, maybe, you know. A lot of it is achieving moderation. Well, I think that, you know, fibromyalgia is a really frustrating condition for doctors to treat. They don't know what causes it, and they don't know what cures it. And you can't see pain, so you can't see it in the body. You have to just trust your patient's reports of pain. And being a doctor, you want to make it go away, so what better thing to do than to give somebody painkillers? However, I think there's been a lot of evidence in the years since the time that I was first given serious heavy narcotics for my fibromyalgia, and now showing that opioids are not the greatest solution for fibromyalgia. I mean, exercise is really a great solution for fibromyalgia, like movement. Stretching and yoga are really good solutions. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether it's different in different parts of the country or what. But I thought that fewer doctors were prescribing opioids because there's just been a backlash against prescribing opioids in general, I think. How did I get started writing, how and why did I get started writing my blog? Because, that's a great question. Because I went into detox over Labor Day of 2008. It was the year after my dad had died. I promised myself that if I went into serious withdrawal again and ran out of fentanyl like way early, I would get myself into detox, and of course that happened. And when I got into detox, the doctor who treated me was really good. He was a good guy and honest, but he didn't know how to detox people on fentanyl. He mainly dealt with like Percocet addicts and Vicodin addicts and stuff. And fentanyl's a whole different ballgame. I mean, so when he told me to go into moderate, to go on to Suboxone, you have to be in moderate to severe withdrawal. And I waited like 12 to 18 hours, but I should have waited like 3 days before I started taking Suboxone. So when I took my first dose of Suboxone, I went into precipitated withdrawal. It was a nightmare. It was beyond. I felt like aliens had moved into my body. I mean, it was, and I couldn't get out of bed. I sweated, I kicked, I cried, and I could barely get up to go to the bathroom for 2 days. And so during those 2 days, I logged on to a public forum for people addicted to opioids, and I created the name Guinevere. And those people wrote back to me and got me through that. I mean, I didn't know who to go to. I had nobody. And my husband was like, oh, why did you do this on such an inconvenient weekend? You know, like, so I couldn't talk to him about that. And I felt guilty that I was addicted anyway. Like, why should he have to live with somebody like me, you know? And I scared my son. So I wrote to these people and said, how can I get better? Like, I have to get better yesterday. Like, I have to get better right now because everybody's upset. And the more I wrote, the more I realized it was the first time in a long time that I'd actually expressed my own direct experience in writing. And I'm a professional writer. I've been writing all my life. I mean, since I was 10, I was keeping a journal. And since I was 20, I was a journalist. And I had 2 books before I wrote these 2 books. So this one in the fall will be my 4th book. So I decided after in my first year of sobriety, I thought maybe I'll start a blog, but I didn't really. I had been warned against it by another writer who said, don't make your sobriety your writing and all that. But then after I relapsed, I thought, I have some things to say that might be able to help people. And I especially think that I could read research and interpret it, because that's what I had done for the foundations that I'd worked for. I could read research and interpret it for a general audience and offer recovering people really reliable information for free. So that was my way of giving back. And I've always kept my blog free. I get pitches all the time for ads and guest posts with links back to other places, and I never take any of those because I just want it to be editorially independent. So that's why I write Guinevere. Well, thank you so much for coming. So grateful.